Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Salima, founder, CEO, and head coach of Unleash Forward and a prestigious and renowned speaker. Salima is a passionate advocate for women of color in the workplace. She frequently speaks on advancing women of color, leadership, and diversity. Notably, she delivered the signature keynote for IWD 2023 at the world's largest e-commerce company. With over 20 years of industry experience as an executive, consultant, and certified coach, Salima has driven accelerated performance and impact for top companies worldwide, including Google, Microsoft, HP, Meta, and many others. As the driving force behind Unleash Forward Inc., a purpose driven leadership accelerator, Salima is dedicated to elevating women and people of color to senior leadership levels and board positions. She believes in the power of diverse perspectives at the leadership table and their positive impact on society, families, and businesses. Prior to her entrepreneurial journey, Salima held prominent positions such as VP Digital at Inaman PR, Senior Vice President of GCI, and Managing Director for Sonic Boom Digital Marketing Agency. Salima's commitment extends beyond her speaking engagements. She actively supports entrepreneurs and women in leadership through initiatives like SheEO, Girls on Boards, and hashtag I Am Remarkable, a Google initiative as a coach and certified facilitator. Well, welcome, Salima. Tell us a little bit more about how you discover your passion and your niche.
Thank you, first of all, for having me here. It's always a very interesting feeling to hear somebody reading your profile back at you. So, how did I find my passion? So, I will say this: that I did not know that coaching and what I'm doing today was a career. I got here by through a series of experiments. I got here through a lot of trial and error, and I got here through sponsors and mentors who saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And what I meant by that is, so I started my career in the technology sector in tech and then in digital marketing. And I was probably doing that for about 15, 17 years. And I started to lose my passion. And I was speaking at a conference, an HR conference. And the gentleman at my table, I was sharing with him that, I'm thinking about what's next. We were just having a meaningful conversation. He's like, well, I just saw you speak and you would be really good at this. And I'm like, what's this? I had no idea what he was talking about. So he was on the faculty for the Canadian Management Center. He made introductions and they're like, oh, you're already a professor. You understand adult education. You've already had executive roles. You understand what it's like to be in a marketing role. You would be very good at this. And that's how I kind of started in leadership development. And so that's how I made the career transition. And then a few years in, somebody said to me, oh, you have a very coaching style approach to the way that you facilitate. And I'm like, what is that? Got curious, followed that, and that's what led me to coaching and getting certified, and that's what led me to my business today.
Amazing. And if you could turn back to, like, let's just say your young professional self,
Mm.
what is one piece of advice that you would offer when it comes to discovering that passion?
There was a line that somebody said to me recently, which is at least she said in an I was part of the audience, and Lisa Laflamme said, "Your comeback will be greater than your setback." And I found that I was like, damn, I wish I had heard that earlier because, I did have a setback, a really big setback. And I had wished I had heard that because I think I wouldn't have been in that, what I call the valley of shame and in that setback for so many years. So to come back to your question around, when you're trying to reinvent yourself, I think it's really, for me, what enabled that was that I just experimented. I experimented, and took some bold moves. And for some people, like it's going to be like really fast that they can, transition over. And for others, it's going to take a little bit longer. But to know that you will land there, you need to get out of your head and you need to see what can I do to experiment to collect some data so I have more information to make a decision on.
I appreciate that. And I'm not sure about you, but like growing up as a visible minority, some of the
Mm.
things that always come to mind when I'm making decisions, whether it's career transition, starting a side hustle, whatever it may be, it's always how will this impact my family? It's almost like an unconscious thought. And sometimes it actually inhibits my willingness to take risks. But other times it's like, well, what do I have to lose? So I'm not sure if you've ever had to overcome that yourself. And if so, how
Mm.
did you?
You know, when you were saying that, reminded me of a time in one of my experiments. I was really nervous to do it. And I actually had this conversation with my girlfriend to be like, well, what happens if I don't stick with this? What happens if, what are people going to think about me if I, what do they think about me? So it was the experiment was selling Stella and Dot, which is jewelry. And it's a business that you don't find, like, you can only buy it through a Stella and Dot consultant. And I was interested in that business because they were so strong in terms of social selling, and I wanted to learn more about that. And also was the fashion side of me, and I'm interested in fashion. And I was just, I was like, and I could really use brushing up on my sales skills. So there were a number of reasons why I wanted to do it, but I was really scared to take that plunge. And I remember having that conversation with my girlfriend, and my girlfriend said, who cares what other people are going to think about you? So what if you do it for 6 months? You have 6 months more experience than everybody else will. And you will have gained so much more from doing that. And so by hearing that back from a close friend of mine, and somebody who I really respected, I was like, okay, maybe I'm being a little harsh on myself. Maybe I am putting a blocker on myself. And so, yeah, definitely we have those moments where we hold ourselves back because we're concerned about what others are going to think.
That's a great call out on just one, it's bouncing off of someone who is objective for the most part, right? Because they're not fully emotionally tied to the situation in itself. And then the other piece of it is the whole notion around removing yourself of what will other people think, because you can't make everyone happy for the rest of your life. There's always going to be someone on the other side of the fence, right? And I guess along your journey, who are some key leaders that have played a significant role in your success, whether in a positive way or in a way where you're like, man, I will never be that way. I'm going to
Um,
go the opposite direction.
well, immediately when you said positive, the person that comes to mind is my mentor, Bill Williams. And he was the one who made the introduction to the Canadian Management Center. And he's also the one who said to me, what other people think of you is none of your business. And I thought that was a really powerful quote. It was from a book. I don't remember which book it was, but he shared that with me. And I was like, okay, you're right. It is none of my business what other people think of me. And so he's been a very inspiring person for me and leader. Another person would be somebody that I worked with in one of my previous roles, and I learned a lot from him. I learned what it meant to belong, what it meant to be able to have somebody that I could be so freely with in terms of talking about the business, that I could challenge. Um, I also learned a lot what not to do. Unfortunately, I would say he's definitely a mentor of mine, but along the way, he also showed me and said things that I would say what is now what I'm advocating for, so that women and people of color don't have to face. So, for example, what I mean by that is in one of the roles that I had, some of the expressions I heard was, oh, we can't buy that company anymore because the owner is pregnant. We can't hire that person anymore because they have a stutter. We can't hire that person because they wouldn't look good in front of the client. So there was a lot of those kinds of things that I heard, which I was like, and you just saw your expression on your face, right, Angela? It's like, to still be hearing that in the year 2000s, it's just not cool. So though that's somebody, it's a weird dynamic of somebody I respected, admired, and learned so much about the business. Very awesome businessman. But at the same time, somebody I learned, I'm like, this is not a way how to run a business and how to treat people.
Well, thank you for your vulnerability. First of all, sharing
Mm.
some of the learnings from that individual, but also like the positive aspect. And for those who can't see our conversation, my expression was my jaw dropped, and in my thoughts, I was like, "What in the actual insert whatever word you want?" Because that is absolutely inappropriate, right?
Yeah.
And I guess as an individual who's held high level leadership roles, when you do hear some of those things, whether it's from a peer or upwards, how have you developed the ability to manage those conversations without burning the bridges?
Yeah, this is a question that also comes up when I talk about allyship in organizations. And I'm like, there's a couple of ways that you can have that conversation. You can say to the person privately and say, hey, you're somebody I really respect. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I think I want you to be aware of this because I respect you and I don't want this to be reflecting negatively towards you. So having that private conversation coming from a place of that you value their and you respect their position within the organization, the contribution that they're making, you come to it like that, I think is a really powerful way to be able to do that. When you're in a meeting and you hear a conversation like that, another way could be to simply do it through questions and to ask to say, hey, is this the right move for us to be doing if we want to be showing that we're an approachable, diverse, respecting organization? So if we ask those questions with that, we are calling that person out without truly calling them out. Because oftentimes people will say the things and then they'll be like, oh, as I said it, I realized what I was saying. Or they've said it and not realized the impact, that it was coming from a different place. But more often than not, it's coming from not a place of maliciousness, but it's just coming from a place of either lack of awareness or just didn't have full context thinking.
Well, thank you for sharing that as well, because I think about just that self-awareness piece as you bring that forward of sometimes we say things, but we mean in another, but then we can never control how others perceive. And sometimes it's just straight up rude, right? So
Mm.
for yourself, as you're working with some of these entrepreneurs in your accelerator that you've developed, what would you say are some of the common issues that they're encountering they lead their organizations are and preparing to scale it?
This is actually an interesting question because you mentioned in my profile, I focus on elevating women and people of color to senior leadership roles. When I started this business, I was not my intention. I never thought that I was going to go niche down this path. And I say that niche kind of found me based on the people who were seeking me out, the people who wanted coaching from me. And it was very scary for me to niche down and to exclude other people whom I was having really great success with. But I'm so glad that I did because I'm finding I can have just such a strong impact. And in my coaching with particularly women of color, what I have found that has been really common has been one around the what I call declaring and sharing is that they know what their vision is, but are afraid to declare it. And they're afraid to declare it because they're afraid how people are going to think about them. They're afraid of people are going to think that they're crazy for wanting to be the president. They think, oh my God, I want to be the VP. What's my boss going to think about me? Or what's my skip levels going to think about me? So they know what they want and desire, or kind of know, but are not letting themselves go to their full potential because they're afraid of what people are going to think and how they're going to respond. So I say that this is one of the first things I work with my clients is on what I call declare and share, which is like if you can declare it in yourself first and then start to share it, that's where that expression of what other people think about your dreams is none of your business. It's your dream. It's your vision for yourself. And I said it starts with knowing with yourself, declaring it with yourself. Then the universe can meet you where you're at and help unfold the path for you. And so that's why I say it's so important for you to declare for yourself first and then start to share it. And it's also important that don't say no to yourself. So if you're holding back your own vision, you're saying no to you. Let everybody else say no to you. That's not your job, but you say yes to yourself and then you go out there and you start to share it. And if you're not being met by others who are willing to accept your vision, then you're just not in the right place. But that doesn't mean your vision is wrong. Just not in the right place for your vision to unfold. And based on all the women I've worked with, I have yet to meet, I think I've had one person where her vision wasn't met, but everybody else was just delighted by the response they get from when they share what their vision is for themselves. So it's a really, really important aspect, and oftentimes where I start with the women of color I work with. So that would be the first one. The second challenge is around the executive presence. And so my viewpoint around executive presence is that it's the conversations that we have within ourselves that creates our executive presence. So oftentimes we think about, oh, did I say the right thing? Am I wearing the right thing? Did I show up, well? But I always say, well, what was the conversation you were having with yourself? Because that will dictate how you show up. So if you're saying, oh, I don't belong in this room, or this is really scary to me, if you're saying those things, those are going to have an impact in terms of how you show up, in terms of your gravitas. And so for me, it's like if we can start to change those messages and those internal dialogue, that's gonna do like 80% of the heavy lifting of your executive presence. That's gonna do 80% of the heavy lifting around what meetings you decide to show up to, about what you're gonna push back on. It's gonna, support you in terms of what causes you want to support. You're gonna see a dramatic impact in terms of you stepping into your voice and you talking about and pushing back and advocating for the things that you believe in the workspace. So I say that's the second obstacle, and one that's totally something that I work with all the time with my clients. For some people it happens quickly, and for other people they need a little bit more time, and that's totally okay. I had another woman I was working with the other day, and she was having a little crisis in confidence. She was coming back from mat leave, and she's like, I never experienced this before I went on mat leave, but now that I've come to mat leave, all of a sudden I don't feel confident. And so sometimes it can be reconnecting with your confidence. But so that would be the second barrier. And then oftentimes the third barrier is not having the tools in terms of how to build influence. And so, we want to be thinking about um, who knows the great work that I am doing, and who knows the impact that I'm having. And so we go through a bit of a stakeholder analysis to understand who are the people that we need to be influencing, who are the people we need to build relationships with, what's going to be my strategy going in with each individual that's an important stakeholder for me, and do they know the great work that I am doing? Who are my advocates around me? So that piece is actually a really important element, as women or as people of color or anybody, in fact, that is looking to advance in their career and they're starting to think about that. That connects back to a framework that I read in a book called by Harvey J. Coleman called The Organization Game Revealed. And what he advocates for is that, you know, we tend to think, particularly as people of color, our parents told us, work hard and you'll get promoted. Great advice in the beginning of your career. Yes, you need to show that you understand your work. You need to show the quality of your work. But as you become more senior, that importance on your performance starts to decrease. So what he says is that there's three elements, three parts to the framework that's going to help you to become more senior in a role. It's your performance, your image, and your exposure. Performance is what you are, your experience. It's your credentials. It's the work that you have done. It's the results you've gotten from the project work that you have done. That's why I said it's so important in the beginning of your career. The next piece is your image, and it's like, what do people think about you, about your work? Are you somebody who does really great work but you have attitude? Are you somebody that gets a result but you leave dead bodies in your wake? Are you somebody that, oh, if I give it to her, she's going to get it done? Are you somebody that, if something's not going right in the business, that they would rely on you and trust you to be able to get those numbers back up? What is it that people think about your work? And then, so that's a bit of about your branding piece. And then the exposure piece is like, who knows the great work that you're doing? Who knows the contribution that you're making? As you become more senior in your career, your performance is actually only 10%. It's a big light bulb moment because everybody already knows what to expect of you. You've already set the bar. They already know what you're capable of. So you don't need to keep proving. You don't need to keep putting into that bank account there because they already know. So it's only worth 10%, but your image and your exposure. Image is 30% and your exposure is the remaining 60%. Choices and decisions about who to promote, who gets what work, is not necessarily based on performance, it's based on the image. It's based on your exposure. Who knows that great work that you're doing? Who's advocating for you when you're not in the room? Who's getting you those assignments? Who's looking out for you? Those decisions get made outside of your performance.
My mind was just blown because when you gave the statistic of only 10% is based on performance when it comes to key decisions like that, I didn't realize how low that number was, right? And it makes sense a lot of times where you sometimes you see someone promoted and you're like, how did you become a leader, right? Because it's not that they don't know what they're doing, but the way that they treat people is just not the best. But I guess they've done a really good job managing upwards and laterally. So I guess for those who struggle to understand what it takes to manage their image
Hmm.
or how to build up that internal brand, what is one piece of advice that you would offer to do that in an organic and tasteful way?
You know, what's so interesting is I was just talking to one of my clients. It was her last session, and she was sharing, we were talking about the impact of the leadership program that she was in, the coaching, the self reflection work that she had done. And she said that she had gotten the highest rating ever in her career at that organization. And I said, "What was the difference for you?" She goes, "Well, my work didn't change. The work that I was doing didn't change, but it was that I invested in my image and my these relationships. I was doing all the great work, but no one knew about it. So now I spent and shifted focus so that I started to show up at meetings differently. I started to have conversations to let people know what my team or myself were doing. And I was asking to be at the meetings that my boss was at so that I was acting as a subject matter expert and people were seeing me. And so by being intentional about what meetings you're showing up, being intentional about being aware of what your image is, because that's the first place you want to start with, is asking your peers, asking your boss, asking, your people around you is like, what is the perception of your work? What kinds of projects would you bring me in? Would you bring me in for one that needs to meet a fast timeline? Would you bring me in for a project that, um, your bonus was relying upon? Would you bring me in on a project that was, multi-long layered, multi-year kind of project? So if you ask it in that way, you'll get a sense of how people see your strengths and your skills. And then you can say, okay, is that how I want to be viewed? And if it's not, then you know that, okay, I have a bit of some work to be done so that I can start to shift the perception of how people are viewing me. So that's first place is take an audit and understand how you're doing it. And then after you've done the audit and you've decided, okay, you want to make some monumental changes here, it's really about knowing how would I describe that? It's an example could be asking to show up to your boss's meeting. So if your team has produced a deck, say, you know what, I'd love to be there, be the subject matter expert. So if anybody has questions, I can totally chime in, take the stress off of you. So asking to be involved in meetings, ask to be get the background in terms of how did this decision get made? I'd love to know what was the thinking behind it. You can also ask like, hey, I'd love to be able to be a fly in the wall and shadow a meeting. So I'd love to hear what's the language that's being used. I'd love to hear how decisions are being made so I get a greater context. Those could be some ways to start. There are many, many more ways. It just depends on, your situation, your career, who you're trying to connect with, that sort of thing.
I appreciate the level of ownership that you've placed on the individual from the perspective of one, it's do an analysis of yourself. Secondly, do the homework, right? Of understanding, okay, where are the areas that I need to be more present in based on my goals and my vision, essentially. And I guess when it comes to a sponsor, because they play a key role in this process as well, um, how have you been able to identify the right sponsor for you
Mm.
and understanding that maybe it's not too many levels in between too high, but the appropriate level essentially?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I get that question a lot. And oftentimes the default is, well, I don't see anybody that looks like me. And so they feel like there's nobody could be their sponsor. And I'm like, no, you're not looking for the person that looks like you. You're looking for the person who has impact on decisions. You're looking for the person who has influence. And somebody of influence can be somebody who reports to you. Somebody of influence can be your peer. Somebody of influence is somebody that's, your boss's boss and your boss's boss's boss, depending where you're in the organization. So you want to look for those individuals who have influence. You want to look for somebody who would benefit from you moving up. But what I mean by that is it actually oftentimes as proteges, we tend to think that we have no power in that equation between sponsor and protege. They're like, well, why would somebody want to sponsor me? But the reality is that if I'm sponsoring you, Angela, and you get promoted, well, guess what? Your promotion looks good on me. I get viewed as somebody who's committed to the organization. I get viewed as somebody who's a really strong leader. So I have something to gain by you being promoted. And so you want to look for somebody who's also developing their leadership, somebody who's also looking to move up in the organization. So by bringing you up, they bring themselves up. So it gives a different lens in terms of how to be thinking about who to be thinking about as your sponsor. And I would say make sure you have multiple sponsors. That is really important. Your boss is your sponsor, and you need to have more than just your boss. You need to have, so for example, I was speaking with an executive, and she was just saying, it was her head of HR, it was her salesperson, it was her boss, and there were a few other individuals that played really key important roles in supporting her promotion. And so that's really important that you have other people within the organization that are your sponsors and that will advocate for you and amplify the impact that you're having.
That's a really great call out on having multiple sponsors, especially with the turbulent times and a lot of people movements. If you
Mm,
put all your eggs into that one basket, unfortunately, you could be screwed once that individual leaves, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah.
thank you for shedding light on that. And I guess as we slowly wrap up on our conversation, one of the questions that came to mind is throughout your corporate executive experience, you coaching clients who are executives as well, what would you say are maybe some of the core attributes of what it takes to actually be an executive?
In every organization, that's going to be different because the expectations, the culture is very different. But I'm going to say the most oftentimes what I have seen is that they're looking for somebody who can take risks. They're looking for somebody who's going to speak up. They're looking for somebody who's going to take ownership, somebody who's almost like an entrepreneur within the organization, so like an intrapreneur, somebody who is a strong leader who lifts others around them, somebody who is willing to take a stand for what they believe in. And that's why I say that piece around how you speak to yourself is so fundamental, because that is going to come up and be part of in every single role that you're in. And as you accelerate and as you move into different roles, you're going to be faced with different situations and scenarios and stuff that you've never been through. I speak to CEOs and they experience what we call imposter syndrome. I'm here with air quotes if you can't see me. And I say everybody has imposter syndrome. It doesn't matter what level of your career, how many years in your career, you're going to face the situation you've never faced before. And you're just going to be feeling like you're walking through it without, like the blind leading the blind, maybe. And you have self doubt. So I always say it's a very human experience to have those emotions. I don't call it a syndrome because it's it's just part of being human. There's nothing wrong with you. There's no sickness. It's just what we call self-doubt. I want to share, to double click on this. There's an article by Rushika Talishan and Judy Ann Barry, I think those are their names, on Harvard Business Review, which I believe it's called "Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome." And they were recently, a few years ago, on Brene Brown's podcast, and Brene Brown shared um, that article was one of the leading articles in Harvard Business Review ever. It's a really powerful article. They look back at the origins of where imposter syndrome comes from, that it's a construct from the 70s, that it no longer applies, and that it actually creates more um, bias against women within the organization. It's something we need to start changing. And so next time you're, talking about imposter syndrome, well, let's rename that in our language so it's not a syndrome. Where I'm experiencing self-doubt, I'm having a crisis in confidence, but it's not a syndrome. You're not an imposter. You're just having some self-doubt. I think it's really powerful to be able to share that with your leaders and for them to be aware of that, because I think that's a really powerful place to kind of unlock the executive presence, to unlock how you're talking to yourself and how you're showing up.
Thank you for sharing that resource. I'm excited to have that link and to share it for your podcast episode. And it kind of ties into my question is when it comes to unleashing an individual and organization's potential, what do you think is required to make that happen?
I always say that it's you need to make a systems. It's a partnership, right? Like you need to make a systems change, and you need to equip the leaders that you're trying to elevate within the organization. So I always say it's one thing to do, give them a coach. It's one thing to give them leadership development, give them the tools that they need to be successful in wanting to promote them. But if you don't change your system that they're operating in, you're really not making a change in overall organization. And the reason why I say that is the amount of senior women that I speak to, they're at the top of their game. They're the chief security officer, they're the chief whatever officer. They've broken the glass ceiling. They've done all the hard work and they get there and they're like, Nothing's changed. This sucks. And they want to leave the role. So if you haven't changed the way decisions are being made, if you haven't changed how they're going to be respected at the table, then just because you have a woman at the table, you have a person of the color of the table, that doesn't mean you've created an inclusive environment. That doesn't mean you've created an environment where they can succeed and feel satisfied. That doesn't mean you've created an environment that's going to allow them to really be at their full potential. So I always say it's like, it's one thing to do the individual work for your leaders, but you need to be looking at your system and understanding how's the system holding everybody back.
What a great call out on the systems aspect of it. And I never thought of it as a partnership, if anything. I always saw it, especially at my level, I always see it as, oh, look, you checked off your checkbox that you're really proud of, right? But then what, right? So you made that call out of that, what that then what looks like essentially. So as we wrap up our conversation, one last question to you is, what is one thing you're working on right now that you're really excited about and want to share with the audience?
My next keynote, it's called Claim Your Worth. And the genesis of this came from two data points that I discovered. The first one is that a difference in $1,000 when we're negotiating our compensation in the beginning of our career can have an impact of $500,000 by the end of our career. Yeah. We don't think about that. We are like, oh, $1,000 after our taxes, after we look at it month by month, we're looking at maybe 50, $60. And so we don't think much about it. It's like no big deal. But that the research has shown is that if we're not negotiating and going for what we believe is our maximum value, then that can have an outcome of 500,000 by the end of our career over a span of 40 years.
Holy smokes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited to keep an eye out on that. And I appreciate all the facts that you've given us and just like the little statistics along the way, because I think it really hammers home some of the impacts of the lack of inclusion and diversity, or some of the ways in which, if key things aren't changed in the system in whatever way it may be, whether it's in the systems that we have for ourselves and how we talk to ourselves, or how the organization creates space for us, it really impacts our ability to achieve our potential at the end of the day, right? So thank you so much again for sharing your story and your expertise, Salima. I really appreciate it. And to everyone else who's tuned into another episode, thank you so much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next episode. Till then, stay safe.